So after releasing my ultrawide monitor video the other day, as expected already and no doubt into the future, the comments on the video contain mentions of people either using or asking about 4K monitors for CAD. And although discussions around high refresh rate panels such as 144Hz are going to spawn, and kind of have done already, I'm going to shelve the refresh rate thing for now because that's just a separate thing for a different thing. At the moment, we're just talking about 60Hz panels, 60Hz monitors, which is just fine for what we do in CAD. Now, understandably, 4K is more of a household term than ultrawide is, probably due to its widespread adoption in the consumer TV space and heavy marketing strategies from TV manufacturers. I mean, if you go on the street and ask the average Joe what 21:9 ultrawide is, they'll look at you like you've got a heavily pregnant huntsman spider crawling up your jumper. But if you ask them, have they heard of 4K? Yeah, most of the people won't know what it actually means. They won't have the foggiest idea what it is, but they'll no doubt have heard of the term 4K many times before on TV, and they'll just know that it's better than regular HD. That's probably what your answer is going to be. So to keep this as simple as possible and to stick to the main point, I'm not going to make any comparisons here between 4K and ultrawide monitors. If you just want a quick answer, a TLDR, I'd recommend 3440 by 1440 ultrawide over a 4K monitor any day of the week for the CAD work that we do. So anyway, what's the deal with 4K then? Well, it's all about your TV, or in this case your monitor's resolution. It's a deep and complex field of study which I'm certainly no expert in, and I don't pretend to be, so I'm speaking in low-level generics here. What are now traditional regular monitors these days will typically run at what's referred to as a 1920 by 1080 resolution. You can check your own resolution by right-clicking on your desktop and go to the display settings. These numbers refer to the horizontal and the vertical total number of pixels displayable by your monitor. So your display can light up 1920 pixels across and 1080 pixels up and down. Back in the days of the old huge box-like CRT monitors, we had display resolutions of 640 by 480 or 1024 by 768 pixels. This was initially a limitation of the early analog interfaces used, such as VGA, but since the widespread adoption of digital interface standards such as DVI, HDMI and DisplayPort, the resolution limitations are now in most cases capped by the maker of the screen in the monitor you're using. There's many other factors that play into this, but don't forget I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible here. So following on from that, 4K is indeed referring to the maximum capable resolution of the monitor that you're using. Most regular monitors, like stated earlier, can light up 1920 by 1080 pixels. 4K monitors, however, can light up 3840 by 2160 pixels. I know 3840 isn't quite 4000 or 4K, but it's just got to be made awkward and quirky in some way, or else it becomes too easy to make sense of, isn't it? The enthusiast purists will make a point of stating that real 4K is actually 4096 by 2160 pixels, which is a standard set by the Digital Cinema Initiative's Consortium for Film Projection, but to my knowledge that isn't used much at all in the PC world. Therefore 4K typically always means 3840 by 2160 pixels. And of course the keen mathematicians out there will have already deduced that this is exactly double the regular resolution of 1920 by 1080. So 4K is exactly twice as many pixels on screen as your everyday monitors. It's not twice as many, but both numbers are twice as big. So anyway, we'll touch back on that later. So now that I've got the stats and the numbers calculated, we've basically arrived at the conclusion that 4K is better, right? Twice as many pixels across and up and down. My brain can't quite grasp the technicalities behind what that actually means inside the monitor, but it sounds better, so that's all right with me. What's your boggle with it, man? Surely it's a good thing. Well, yes, for the most part, 4K is a good thing, especially for TV and films. 4K is better in almost every respect. For example, imagine a 42-inch fairly modern flat panel TV. Most of them are 1080p Full HD, which means the TV panel has a resolution of 1920 by 1080 pixels, the same as our monitors do. Although the P in 1080p doesn't stand for pixels, it stands for progressive scan, which is all to do with how the image is drawn onto the TV. You can also get 1080i, which stands for interlace, but yeah, don't worry about it. Anyway, the 1920 by 1080 basic maths is 2,073,600 pixels being displayed in total on your 42-inch screen. At 4K though, on the same sized 42-inch TV, you get 8,294,400 pixels, exactly 4 times more pixels squeezed into the same 42-inch space. Not double, no, 4 times as many pixels. So providing that you're watching a video recorded at 4K, or in some cases upscale to 4K, but again, let's not go into that, the image is inevitably going to look crispy sharper and more defined on the 4K TV because the picture is drawn onto 4 times as many pixels. Take a look at this image, for example. Credit Ibrahim Sidawi on the EOS HD forum in a 3-year-old post. Link in the description for please don't copyright strike me protection. Ignoring the fact that his article says the P in 1080p stands for pixels, it is actually a good article, and it's a good visual check on how image quality differs across resolutions if it was shown on the same size display. So now you can imagine how I get all autistically frustrated when I hear wannabe edgelords complaining about how there's no difference when watching HD channels on Sky or cable. There's no difference at all with that HD malarkey. It all looks the same as it always did. It's a big con. It's a rip-off. Placebo upselling. DVD to Blu-ray, which is 1080 to 4K. No, stop trying to be all quirky and edgy and clever because you heard Bill over the road saying it was all a marketing scam. There is factually more pixels here, and it's objectively a clearer image. So either your eyesight's dreadful, or you're choosing not to see the enhancement in sharpness to be all edgy and different. Anyway, kind of deviating off the point here. But that's the lowdown on 4K. So back to PCs and CAD and all that. So Neil, you've just told me that 4K is 4 times as many pixels, clearer, sharper images, CAD and super pristine clarity. Am I right? Woo, loads more screen real estate. No, not really. Well, kinda yes, but no, not really. It's not that cut and dry, I'm afraid. You see, PCs aren't TVs. Programs aren't movies. Here's what I mean. When a developer designs a program for a PC, they have to predefine the size of all of their dialog boxes, all the text, all the objects in the code for their software. They've got to predefine how big all that's going to be. And for the most part, they optimize the size of the program visuals, I imagine, for the more popular 1920 by 1080 resolution. Let's use a familiar example. The Windows taskbar that runs by default along the bottom of every Windows computer ever. When Microsoft designed Windows, they don't and they can't inject black magic into the code so that if you're using a tiny monitor with horrendously small resolution, then the taskbar automatically shrinks and resizes itself so that it still just takes up a tiny small amount of space at the bottom. No, it looks like this on an 800 by 600 resolution. And that's because Microsoft designed indeed the taskbar to be 40 pixels in height. That's a fixed default height and it can't be smaller. Same goes for like dialog boxes, text, icons. They all have a default size in pixels, and when you've only got 600 pixels up and down, that 40 pixel taskbar looks massive. But when you've got 1080 pixels, and as per 1920 by 1080, it looks normal, it looks fine, because they've designed the 40 pixels with 1080 pixels of real estate in mind, and being a pretty safe bet that that's what the user's going to have. So now we're finally getting to the main point of this piece. 4K, don't forget, is 3840 by 2160. That's 2160 pixels up and down. Suddenly, that 40 pixel taskbar isn't so reasonably sized, is it? It disappears off into obscurity. It's still the same 40 pixels in height as it was on a regular screen, but now you've got 2160 pixels up and down. You see what I mean? And in addition to that, your typical 9 pixels in height text, for example, becomes pretty unreadable unless your name's Eagle McHawk Eyes. The buttons are all tiny, icons are unreadable. Bottom line is, it's a great story, but this is all completely unusable. So Neil, how can anyone be using a 4K monitor with Windows at all then? Well, currently, when a 4K resolution is used with a 4K compatible monitor, Windows enables a thing called display scaling. What happens is it applies a scale factor increase to all the objects in an application on an individual object by object basis, and you do this within Windows. So all your text, your title bars, your icons, all your buttons, they're all increased by scale factor. So given that 4K is 200% larger in both axes than the traditional 1920 by 1080 resolution, you typically use a Windows display scale factor of 200% to try and make everything look like it does on a regular 1920 by 1080 display. Problem solved, right? What's the point of this, Neil? Surely that solves the problem. What's your boggle? Well, hold your horses, Kino. Unfortunately, the display scaling doesn't always work as expected. If you want to understand the ins and outs of display scaling and how it works, but more to the point, how it sometimes doesn't work, Linus did a decent video on this over on his TechWiki channel. I'll not regurgitate what he's already presented there, so a link to that is in the description of this video. But yeah, basically, it boils down to whether or not or also how well the developer of your application has optimized their user interface for high resolution displays. Some haven't, some have and have done it very well, some have and have done a proper half-assed job of it. So you've got your 4K monitor, you've set your resolution to 4K, you've set your display scaling to 200% so that the text and all the buttons all scale up to a decent size, you're all happy as Larry, you've done everything that you've been told, and aye, this happens. This is Autodesk Vault Professional at 4K with 200% corrective display scaling enabled. It's utterly unusable. And this is Microsoft's own remote desktop on 4K resolution dialed into a remote workstation. Again, absolutely unusably awful. There's loads of applications like this and you don't know how they'll play on 4K until you try them. Some applications like Vault Professional, as shown before, have workarounds that let you alter how display scaling works, but here's the news. As I say a lot over here, this isn't enthusiast gaming advice. This is advice for small businesses through to enterprise level professionals. And if I'm putting 200 up to 2,000 monitors into a business and I've got to enforce desktop level shortcut fiddly workarounds which frankly will break and reset, or I've got to deploy registry edits or system level hacks just to make an application display clearly on a 4K screen, well, I'm soz, but I can't recommend 4K screens at this point. There's a massive intake of micromanagement aggro that I could really do without bringing upon myself. Even with the display scaling workaround enabled, using Vault Professional as an example, you can see some of the on-screen elements just don't sit right. Just dialog boxes look all off whack. Some of the prompts seem to bypass the scaling completely. I mean, as far as I know, it doesn't make anything unstable as such and prone to crashing, but it's just unsightly, it's awkward, and it's uncomfortable to use. And if, like me, you use remote desktop regularly, then it makes it pretty much impossible to use because that's just unworkable. Having said that though, some applications seem to cope with display scaling quite alright on face value, like AutoCAD for example. The devs have made an explicit determined effort to ensure the application displays pretty seamless on 4K with display scaling enabled, and the same goes with Inventor. But there's always something, it might be minor, but there's something somewhere within the application, it seems, that always just doesn't look right, and that knocks your confidence in feeling at ease with the program. And I've said before that I'm no expert, so this is just speculation, but given that previously, especially in Inventor, some elements scaled okay, but some seem to have been completely missed by scaling. Certain parts of Inventor just were completely ignored by scaling. But then in the next version they were fixed, and that makes it feel like some areas are targeted individually by developers for whatever reason, and that in turn takes my train of thought off to a place of thinking, well, what if they've missed some obscure parts of the program, something I use but not many other people do? Will that show up completely broken when I eventually get around to using that part of the program? Paranoia aside, most flagship hero products seem to have been smoothed out on 4K with scaling at this point, but for me personally, that's just not enough to be happy with working in 4K all day and every day. Again, for me, the remote desktop issue on its own is enough to be a complete deal-breaking showstopper using a 4K monitor. And now, as you've probably guessed by now, I do have a 4K monitor at hand. It's integrated into my Alienware laptop, which I bought long before I knew anything about the issues of 4K. And what I've found myself doing, and this is pretty bad, is when I'm using the laptop at work, which is pretty much almost all of the time, I'm having to set my resolution down to 1920 by 1080 just to get the applications that I use to display correctly. At first, in the early days, I ran it at 4K, and then whenever I needed to use remote desktop, for example, I had to remember to set the resolution down prior to connecting into a workstation, which on its own merit is a monumental hassle, especially if you forget to do it on your first attempt. But what I found pretty quickly is that for the most part, when you were doing that, it just wasn't a feasible workflow. Yes, your screen nerfs down to 1920 by 1080, yes, remote desktop worked, but Windows in turn changes the display scaling from 200% down to 100%, which screws up a bunch of other things until you either log out or do a reboot, essentially. And not to mention that on a monitor designed to run at 4K, 1920 by 1080 looks really quite blurry, and it's just not the experience you'd be expecting for whatever price premium you paid to have that 4K screen. So the bottom line here is I have a 4K screen and I mostly do my work at 1080 resolution. Take from that what you will. So a couple of final points before we wrap this up. With 4K and a 200% interface display scale, you don't get any more real estate on your screen than you do when you're running at 1920 by 1080. You could run a lower display scale, something like 150% scaling, but you might need to call in the services of your mate Eagle McCaw guys to come in and translate things on screen for you. And lastly, 4K resolution places a significant higher load on your system hardware, therefore lowering graphical performance. You could maybe argue that this shouldn't be an issue for most professional 4K buyers. If you're able to justify and have the budget for 4K displays, then one could assume that you aren't cheaping out on low-end graphics cards and CPUs, but it's just something to keep in mind. And lastly, the absolute bottom line here is that 1920 by 1080 resolution requires your system graphics card and CPU to deliver just over 2 million pixels to the monitor, whereas 4K sees your system hardware calculating, handling and delivering over 8 million pixels to the monitor. And in CAD, that's a heavy burden on the hardware. Higher end current gen hardware should cope with it, but low end parts they'll tangibly struggle to deliver a smooth visual experience if you're running 4K resolution. Right mate, that'll do it for us now. Touching back on the TLDR, obviously I'd recommend an ultra-wide monitor over 4K for CAD designers and engineers all day long at this point. You don't really get any more screen real estate with 4K, whereas with ultra-wide, that just changes the game completely. It's a different ballgame altogether, and right now it just seems to bring more problems than it solves by using 4K. But that's just for us CAD professionals though. If you work in a graphic design house or a special effects CGI studio, then pretty much everything that I've said won't apply, as the benefit of having a sharper, more refined picture on 4K massively outweighs the scaling anomalies for you. But in CAD, we just don't need our solid models to look sharp. It's just not a thing. But since when does not needing something stop us from wanting it? Anyway, thanks for your valuable attention, your time. Check out all the links I've put into the description of the video, and I'll see you pros in the next one. Toodles.